Assalamu alaikum, welcome to Vetlek. Today I am going to discuss the anatomy of small and large intestine of ox, horse, and dog. First, I am discussing the small intestine of dog. Small intestine is the part of gastrointestinal tract which extends from the pylorus of the stomach to the large intestine. And the function of the small intestine is in the digestion and absorption of the food. And this small intestine is further divided into three parts, and these are duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. Now let's talk about the duodenum. Duodenum is the cranial part of the duodenum extends cranially from the pylorus, then it forms cranial duodenal flexure, and finally it turns caudally. So first the duodenum extends from the pylorus cranially, then it forms cranial duodenal flexure, and then it finally turns caudally. And when it turns caudally, it forms descending duodenum, which continues caudally on the abdomen's right side in contact with the right abdominal wall. The bile and pancreatic ducts also empty into the descending duodenum. This descending duodenum continues caudally, and then it forms caudal flexure. And after the caudal flexure, this descending duodenum becomes the ascending duodenum, and this ascending duodenum continues to move cranially, and finally it terminates at the duodenojejunal flexure. This ascending duodenum, like descending duodenum, is also present on the right side of the abdominal wall. There is a ligament called duodenocolic ligament which connects the caudal flexure of the duodenum and the ascending duodenum to the descending colon. So on one side, the duodenocolic ligament starts from the ascending from the caudal flexure of the duodenum and terminates at the ascending duodenum, and on the other side, it attaches to the descending colon. If we talk about the mesentery of the duodenum, then it is shorter than other parts of the small intestine, and therefore the small intestine is fixed in its position. The point at which the duodenocolic ligament ends at the ascending duodenum is actually the starting point of jejunum. So, where the duodenocolic ligament ends on the ascending duodenum, from that point the jejunum starts. Now, let's talk about the jejunum, which is the longest part of the small intestine. The jejunum begins at the duodenojejunal flexure and then runs caudo-ventrally and forms many coils and loops, and it also occupies the ventral abdominal cavity. The mesentery of the jejunum is very long as compared with the mesentery of the duodenum. So the duodenum is present on the right side of the abdominal cavity, or on the right abdominal wall, and on the other hand, the jejunum is located in the ventral part of the abdominal cavity. The last portion of the small intestine which comes after the jejunum is ileum. In all animals, a fold extends between the ileum and cecum, and this fold is known as ileocecal fold. And in animals other than canines, this ileocecal fold is very large, such that if we follow it, then it ends at the border between the ileum and jejunum. So, in animals other than canines, the termination of this ileocecal fold towards the jejunum is actually a border between the ileum and jejunum, but it is not a case in canines. In canines, this ileocecal fold is very short, so we cannot follow it in order to determine the border between the ileum and jejunum. So, in order to determine the starting point of the ileum from the jejunum, we follow the antimesenteric ileal branch. So, on the antimesenteric surface of the ileum, an antimesenteric ileal branch is present, and if we follow this artery from the cecum towards jejunum, or when we move from the cecum towards the jejunum following this antimesenteric ileal branch, then we find the border of the ileum and jejunum, where this antimesenteric ileal branch terminates. So the termination point of the antimesenteric ileal branch on the jejunum is actually the border between the ileum and jejunum, and it is an identification mark in case of canines. Now I am going to discuss the large intestine. The large intestine is the portion of gastrointestinal tract which extends from the ileum to the anus, and it functions to dehydrate the fecal content by absorbing water. The parts of the large intestine are cecum, colon, rectum, and anal canal. First, I'm going to discuss the cecum. Cecum of the carnivores like dog is the blind diverticulum at the beginning of the colon, and cecum of carnivores is a S-shaped structure which is not well developed because they don't need the process of fermentation or fermentation products. Therefore, their cecum is not well developed, and their cecum S-shaped cecum is always filled with gas. As I have said that cecum is like a blind diverticulum at the beginning of the colon, so the opening from the cecum into the colon is called cecocolic orifice. There is a fold of peritoneum which connects the cecum with ileum, and it is called ileocecal fold. Now I am going to discuss the colon. The colon is divided into ascending colon, transverse colon, and descending colon. So the first part of the colon is ascending colon. The ascending colon extends cranially inside the abdominal cavity, and it is present on the right side of the dorsal abdomen, but it is present medial to the descending duodenum. So both the duodenum and ascending colon are present on the right side of the abdominal cavity, but the ascending colon is present medial to the descending duodenum, and it is also present somewhat dorsally inside the abdominal cavity. Ileum and colon are connected with each other through ileocolic orifice, which is the ileal opening into the colon. Because after the ileum, the first portion of the large intestine is colon and not the cecum, because cecum is the blind diverticulum of colon. The ascending colon continues to move cranially, or it extends cranially, but when it reaches the mesenteric root, then it arches around the mesenteric root from right to left, and in this way the portion of the colon that is formed around the mesenteric root is called transverse colon, and this arc of the transverse colon around the mesenteric root is present cranially. So in this way, transverse colon is formed. After this transverse colon, the last portion of the large intestine, the last portion of the colon extends from the transverse colon caudally on the left side of the dorsal abdomen to the pelvic inlet, and this part is called descending colon. So the descending colon extends caudally from the transverse colon. It is present on the left side of dorsal abdomen, and it extends up to the pelvic inlet, and after it the rectum starts. The descending colon is the longest segment of the large intestine and extends from the transverse colon cranially to the pelvic inlet caudally. The descending colon is attached to the dorsal abdominal wall by mesentery. Now, there is no clear demarcation between the rectum and descending colon. So, the only way to find the junction between the descending colon and rectum, it is necessary to follow the path of the caudal mesenteric artery. Caudal mesenteric artery is actually an artery from the abdominal aorta, and it moves towards the descending colon. And when it reaches the descending colon, it gives two branches, and these are cranial branch and a caudal branch. The cranial branch of caudal mesenteric artery supplies the descending colon, and this artery is called left colic artery, while the caudal branch of the caudal mesenteric artery moves caudally to supply the rectum, and it is called cranial rectal artery. So, this caudal mesenteric artery is supplying left colic artery to the descending colon and cranial rectal artery to the rectum. So, at the level of the caudal mesenteric artery, the junction of descending colon and rectum can be considered. So, after the descending colon, the next portion of the large intestine is rectum, which is the large, which extends from the descending colon to the anal canal. After the rectum, there comes the anal canal, which is the short termination of the alimentary canal, and it opens to the exterior as anus, and anus is the external opening of the large intestine. Now, let's move to the large intestine of horse. The first part of the large intestine of horse is cecum, which is a huge comma-shaped structure and occupies the much of the right abdominal cavity. Cecum of the dog was not well developed, and it was S-shaped structure, but it is not a case in equines. So in case of horse, it is a huge structure, and it is further divided into three parts, and these are the a base, body, and apex of the cecum. So the beginning of the cecum is called base, which is actually a bulbous beginning of the cecum in the right paralumbar fossa. After the base of cecum, there comes the body of cecum, which is a continuation of the base, and it continues cranially along the right wall and floor of the abdominal cavity. And after the body, there comes the apex, which is the tapered end of the cecum on the floor of abdominal cavity, caudal to the xiphoid cartilage. Around this apex of the cecum, the ventral colon wraps around it. So the cecum of horse, we can say that it is present in an oblique fashion, such that its base starts from the right paralumbar fossa, and its apex lies on the floor of the abdominal cavity, and its apex is present just caudal to the xiphoid cartilage. In case of horse, there is an ilial opening into the base of the cecum, which is called ileocecal opening. But we have discussed that in other domestic species, the ilium opens into the colon, which is the very first part of the large intestine after the ilium. But it is not the case in horses. So in horse there is ileocecal opening instead of ileocolic opening. Similarly, the opening between the cecum and ascending colon is called cecocolic orifice. So this was all about the cecum of the horse. Now move to the colon. The colon of horse is highly modified structure, and it has a greater capacity. The colon of equines contains different parts, which I'm going to discuss now. The first part of the colon of the horse is called ascending colon. So this ascending colon of the equine's colon is further divided into different parts, which I shall discuss later. So the ascending colon of the horse is in the form of a double horseshoe shaped loop, and it contains two loops lying on the top of each other. And the shape of these two loops is like the horseshoe. The front of these two loops is towards the diaphragm, and the turn between these two loops is towards the pelvic inlet. So the first portion of the ascending colon of horse is the right ventral colon, which begins from the cecocolic opening and then extends cranially on the right abdominal floor up to the sternum. So there is another point to remember, that colon is present in the ventrally in the abdominal cavity, and it is not present dorsally. So the right ventral colon starts from the cecocolic opening and extends up to the sternum, and is present and continues to move cranially, and it is present on the right abdominal floor. After the right ventral colon, there comes the sternal flexure, which is actually a connection between right ventral colon and left ventral colon. And this sternal flexure curves around the apex of the cecum. So after this sternal flexure, the colon continues to move caudally, and the portion of the colon thus formed is called left ventral colon, which is actually the continuation of the sternal flexure, and it moves up to the pelvic flexure. It ends in the pelvic flexure caudally. So the pelvic flexure is again a connection of the left ventral colon and left dorsal colon, and this pelvic flexure is present in the left paralumbar fossa near the pelvic inlet. After this pelvic flexure, the colon again continues to move cranially, and the portion of the colon thus formed is called left dorsal colon, which is the continuation of the pelvic flexure cranially on the top of the left ventral colon. So this left dorsal colon is present on the top of left ventral colon, and it is connected with left ventral colon through pelvic flexure. And this left dorsal colon continues to move cranially. And this left dorsal colon is present against the left abdominal wall. After the left dorsal colon, there comes the diaphragmatic flexure, which is the continuation of left dorsal colon on the top of sternal flexure. So diaphragmatic flexure is actually present on the top of sternal flexure, and left dorsal colon is present on the top of left ventral colon. And the left dorsal colon and right dorsal colon are connected through diaphragmatic flexure. So diaphragmatic flexure is the continuation of the left dorsal colon, and after the diaphragmatic flexure, there comes the right dorsal colon, which again continues to move caudally. So the right dorsal colon is the greatly expanded continuation of the diaphragmatic flexure caudally up to the transverse colon. So right dorsal colon extends from the diaphragmatic flexure cranially up to the transverse colon caudally. And in this way, we can say that right dorsal colon extends caudally. I am again repeating the whole structure. You have just to follow a double U-shaped structure. So imagine a double U shape, and the first part that from which we are starting is the imagine that the first part is the right ventral colon. So let's suppose that the first part of this double U-shaped structure is the right ventral colon, and continue to move towards the bend of this double U-shaped structure. So from the right ventral colon, we say that right ventral colon extends from cecocolic opening up to the sternal flexure, which is an arc of this double U-shaped structure. After this sternal flexure, we move caudally, and this portion of the colon is called left ventral colon. And after this left ventral colon, there again comes up a flexure which is called pelvic flexure, which connects this ventral U-shaped structure to the dorsal U-shaped structure. So after pelvic flexure, we again move towards the arc of the double U-shaped structure, and the portion of the colon here is called left dorsal colon. And after this left dorsal colon, again arc of the U-shaped structure comes, and this arc is called diaphragmatic flexure. And after the diaphragmatic flexure, we again move caudally, and the portion of the colon which is formed is called right dorsal colon. The right ventral colon is present cranially on the right abdominal floor, caudal to the sternum. The sternal flexure is present around the apex of the cecum. The left ventral colon is present towards the left abdominal wall. The pelvic flexure is present near the pelvic inlet, and the left dorsal colon, like left ventral colon, is present against the left abdominal wall, and diaphragmatic flexure and right dorsal colon are present on the ventral portions of the colon. So after the right dorsal colon, there comes the transverse colon, and this transverse colon is the segment of colon which curves from right to left cranially to the root of mesentery. So in short, the right dorsal colon again curves cranially, and the portion of the colon is called transverse colon. Sorry, this transverse colon curves from the right to left, but it is present in the caudal aspect of the abdominal cavity. So after this transverse colon, there comes the descending colon, which is the continuation of the transverse colon to the rectum. The descending colon is smaller than the ascending colon, and therefore this descending colon is also called small colon. Compared to the other domestic species, the descending colon of the horse is long, with a long mesocolon, and it allows a wide range of motion. The mesocolon is actually a connecting peritoneum which arises from the abdominal roof, and it extends between the dorsal colon and ventral colon. The cecum and colon of the horse have special feature which is absent in other animals, and it is that the cecum and colon of the horse contain variable number of longitudinal smooth muscle cords, and these smooth muscle cords are called bands or tenii. So these bands in the walls of cecum and ventral colon cause the formation of a series of pouches called saculations or hostra, and these bands and saculations or hostra are the feature which is present only in equines. Now let's move to the large intestine of sheep. Cecum is the large blind sac, is a large blind sac, and it is a tube which extends from the ileocolic junction caudally. So it is present. Cecum is present caudal to the ileocolic junction. After the cecum, there comes the colon, and the colon of sheep is again divided into three parts, which are ascending colon, descending colon, and transverse colon. The ascending colon of the sheep is further divided into proximal loop, spiral loop, and distal loop. The proximal loop of the ascending colon of sheep is actually a S-shaped structure or S-shaped loop, which continues the cecum cranially. Then it doubles back caudally on the right side of mesentery, and again it bends cranially on the left side of mesentery, and then it continues as the spiral loop. So the proximal loop of the ascending colon extends between the cecum and the spiral loop, and between these two portions, it forms a S-shaped loop, such that first it continues cranially, then doubles back caudally on the right side, and then again bends cranially on the left side of mesentery. So after the proximal loop, the next portion of the ascending colon of sheep is the spiral loop. This spiral loop is the segment of the ascending colon which is rolled upon itself, and in this way it forms a flat disc which is attached to the left side of the mesentery. This flat disc is formed by two centripetal turns towards the central flexure and two centrifugal turns away from the central flexure. So first two centripetal turns move towards the central flexure, or two spirals move towards the central flexure, and after that the two centrifugal turns or two spirals move away from the central flexure. These centrifugal turns, which are moving away from the central flexure, then continue as the distal loop of the ascending colon. In case of sheep and goat, the last centrifugal coil, which is moving away from the central flexure, separates from this spiral loop and then passes in the greater mesentery near the jejunal coils before continuing as a distal loop. After the spiral loop is the distal loop of ascending colon. The distal loop is a U-shaped loop which runs first caudally on the left side of mesentery, and then again it continues cranially on the right side of mesentery to become the transverse colon. After this distal loop is the transverse colon, which arches from right to left again in front of the mesenteric root in order to become the descending colon. So first the distal loop continues to move caudally, then it bends from left side to the right side and continues to move cranially, and then transverse colon comes. Then the transverse colon again bends to move from cranial side to caudal side. So transverse colon bends from right to left in order to move caudally. So after the transverse colon is the descending colon, which is a continuation of the transverse colon, and it is also present caudally on the abdomen's left side, just next to the ascending duodenum. So both the descending colon and ascending duodenum are connected through duodenocolic ligament. There is another feature in the descending colon of the sheep, and that feature is the sigmoid flexure. The sigmoid flexure is actually the region of the descending colon with a long mesocolon, and this mesocolon hangs down in the abdomen, and it allows a great range of motion during the rectal palpation. So, after the sigmoid flexure is the rectum, which is the continuation of the descending colon into the pelvic cavity to terminate in the anal canal and anus.